Welcome everyone to Color Commentary. We are your Pauper commentators, Michael Petchik and Adrian Guarzales. How's it going, Adrian?
Very well. How are you, Mike?
Doing pretty good. We got a bit of a storm coming up here, but apart from that, not much going on in my life. I start classes next week, so that's the big thing.
The great nor'easter.
Yeah, it's gonna be either 1 or 3 feet of snow. We never know. All right, let's take care of the upkeep because we've got a big topic to kind of get to today. First off, I want to let you guys know out there in podcast land about Original Magic Art. They help bring this show to you every week. They are a really neat store. They produce all sorts of playmats, dice bags, tokens, and art prints of both art from Magic's history and art from the rest of the world's history. And they make really, really solid products. The quality is excellent, and they're constantly working with magic artists to get official magic art officially licensed on playmats, and it all looks really gorgeous. So if you're looking for something to kind of spruce up your play experience, nice fancy tokens, a little bit nicer playmat, go there. You can use the affiliate code Commontary, all caps, spelled as it is in the name of this podcast. And that'll give you 5% off your total order, and we get a little bit of a kickback from your order. So you're both getting a little bit of a discount, and you're helping out the show as well. What do you have for us this week, Adrian?
Well, as always, we have Patreon. For just $1 an episode, you too can hear the full show, including the pre and post shows, as well as getting access to our patron exclusive Discord channel. Pretty sweet deal, if you ask me.
Yeah, and definitely helps keep us doing this. Obviously, we'd still do it even if we weren't getting paid, but
keeps the lights on.
Keeps the lights on. Allows us to at some point in the future expand, pay for stuff for the show. It's all good. All right, let's get into the topic for today because it is kind of a big one. This is going to be part 1 of several episodes. We want to kind of do a primer on the format. It's been a while since we've kind of done the 3,000-foot view of the format and kind of taken a look at the format for new players, people who have not played the format as long as we have. Obviously, a lot of our content is more aimed at invested in franchise Pauper players. So these next couple of episodes are going to be us kind of breaking down the format so that someone who has never played Pauper before has an idea of what the metagame looks like for this format. And we're going to be covering a handful of decks today. We're going to be covering a handful next week. And then if need be, we're going to have a third episode. So between 2 and 3 episodes of this, and it's going to be kind of us talking about the metagame from a single deck's perspective. We're going to talk about what makes these decks work, what their game plan is, the sort of type of strategy that they sort of embody, and then talk about what you as an opponent can do to kind of disrupt these decks' game plans. And let's get it started with a classic. Let's talk about Blue Delver. Adrian, what type of deck is this, and what is it all about?
So Blue Delver is and we love to say this on the show, it is a tempo deck, and it's a deck that's been around for quite a while. Traditionally, it is, obviously it's named after its namesake, Delver of Secrets, everyone's favorite blue 1-drop. But throughout the years, it's also had, really, I think the strength that lies in it's this collection of fairies. So you now have Fairy Miscreant, which is a 1-drop that will draw you a card if you play another one. Spellstutter Sprite, which is a very strong card. Ninja the Deep Hours for card advantage, and eventually it hopes to win the air game with Spire Golem and just bury its opponents in card advantage. It gets to play Counterspell, which is the best counterspell in our format, or one of them. Daze, Brainstorm, Ponder, Preordain, just a bunch of good cantrips. It's also a Gush deck, which I think is one of the strongest cards in the format. So it's really just an old favorite. It's a solid deck.
Yeah, and within that tempo plan, it aims to resolve a few threats and keep them on the board, and that's kind of why Delver is so key to this plan, is because it's just a hyper efficient body for the mana cost. You're running a lot of instants and sorceries anyway. You're also happen to be running a lot of top deck manipulation in the deck, so you can almost guarantee that Delver is going to flip by turn 3 at the latest. So it has these very, very aggressive starts, and it's got a lot of neat little synergies. It's got a Ninja the Deep Hours, which allows you to bounce some of these fairies that have ETB effects. So you can kind of reuse your fairy miscreant. You can reuse the spell stutter sprite's counter ability. And the really great thing about this is those creatures are already evasive, so they're more likely to be unblocked, more likely to be able to be targets for the ninjutsu ability. So it kind of has this broad synergy that kind of like every card synergizes with another part of the deck, but none of them synergize with everything, and it works out really well. Would you say that this is comparable to Delver decks and other formats a little bit?
So the one thing we lose out on in Pauper is we lose out on a lot of the disruptive elements you might find in other decks. So sure, we have Ninja, the Deep Hour spell stutter sprite. That's well and good. Especially, Counterspell is fine too, and of course we have the cantrips. But I think one of the strengths of the Delver decks and other formats is that they can also rely on cards like Young Pyromancer in the blue-red versions, Tarmogoyf in some of the Sultai versions, and then they generally have a bit more disruption to back up their game plan.
Yeah, it still kind of has the same core idea of resolving a handful of threats and safeguarding them to some extent. So it's not the biggest leap from those decks, but it is pretty consistently tier 1 and has been for ages within the format. So what sort of things easily disrupt this deck? What sort of things are kind of the wrench in the cogs, so to speak?
Basically anything that gets resolved and is bigger than the creatures that you are playing, in my experience. So let's look at some of the quote-unquote removal that we have. We have 4 copies of Snap. Snap lets you bounce a permanent untap island or untap land, so that's great for bouncing something and leaving it maybe a counterspell on its way back down. But the deck really struggles with getting things off the table on a permanent basis. That's just the deck I'm looking at right now. On the sideboard, you could have things like Gut Shot, which is good in the mirror, especially. Curse of Chains and Narcolepsy are some other ones you could run, which tap opponents' creatures. But it really cannot like decks that barf up their hand, and each thing is like kind of not really worth countering, or everything is like sort of equal. The counter spells can't really fight through it, and if they resolve like a big threat, the deck has a problem dealing with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And traditionally that kind of entails a not great matchup against decks like Elves, which, as you so eloquently put it, kind of vomits its hand onto the board very, very quickly. Your counter spells quickly, there are better targets for them, but you're not going to keep pace with how quickly it's going to be casting spells. And also something like Green Stompy, which, while not quite the force it used to be in the format, is still present. And since it relies on incredibly efficient power to mana cost ratios, it's running a lot of 1-drops, and while it's great for your spell stutter sprites, it does kind of put you at a mana disadvantage where you're using 2 mana spells to deal with 1 mana cards. So if you're keeping pace in terms of lands, they're just able to cast more things than you're conceivably able to counter. So traditionally, kind of Stompy preyed heavily upon this deck as something that just couldn't keep pace with it. So those are kind of the soft spots for the deck. Now in terms of cards specifically, not necessarily strategies, so sort of more the sideboard cards, what kind of things in that regards, if you're playing a brew, do you want to have in the board to handle this matchup?
I think this deck is very weak to Electrickery. It's one of the deck's traditional foils. I don't know if that's the right term, but that card, Pyroblast, is also very good against the deck. Just destroying blue things and countering blue things is good. But also, you can sort of just go over the top, right? Like, if you're able to land a big threat that they can't deal with, you're going to win the game.
Yeah, quick Ulamog's Crusher can, really, really mess up this deck's day just by, if you can't counter it, they're just going to start running you over real quickly. So, yeah, it doesn't fare well against those huge threats. And yeah, I think that's a fair analysis. I mean, I don't think that, Electrickery is a perfect answer to this deck, but it really does help. And this deck definitely has a bad time against someone resolving an even cards justice. That definitely that kills everything except the Spire Golems, and some versions of this deck have even shied away from running the Spire Golems. Anything else you want to touch on with Blue Delver before we move on to its newer cousin?
I think that one of the things that you should really consider when we talk about these decks is the fact that they're both gush decks and the fact that they're both like cantrippy style decks. I really think that that is where you want to be right now in the format, which is I think why we put these up here at the front.
Okay.
We'll get into the deck's cousin, but one of the things I really want to stress about making the transition is I want to take a look at the removal suite in the blue-red version because I think that's really what sets it apart.
Yeah, definitely. So the blue-red version is notable for two things. Obviously, it has a secondary color, and it also runs snowlands instead of the regular basics because it's one of the real big upgrades that it gets is in the form of Scred, which is a one red for a instant. It deals X damage to target creature, where X is the number of snow lands that you control. So Scred kind of is unique within Pauper as it's a 1 mana piece of removal that scales really well with the game. Generally, it will be able to remove most of the threats that are being played the turn after they're being played, which works out really, really nicely. So what else differentiates these decks from one another?
The other thing that you get is you get access to copies of Ash Barrens and Evolving Wilds, fetch effects. So you're able to leverage your brainstorms maybe a little bit better. The creature base is actually largely the same. You do lose Spire Golem because you're no longer playing mono islands. And I think you want to be doing other things with this deck. But still a gush deck, which I think is very important. And then in the sideboard, you get access to Pyroblast, traditionally your arch nemesis in Mono Blue Delver, as well as some extra cards like Gorilla Shaman to go against Affinity. Swirling Sandstorm is another special these decks play where they're able to actually run the closest approximation we have to a board wipe in the format. It is a board wipe, but it's a very situational one. Yeah, I think the sideboard, and then you also get access to Trickery, so you're incidentally really good against the Mono Blue Delver deck as well. So
yeah, and also the fact that it's just running more sort of permanent spot removal versus, your Vapor Snags and Snaps means that it does kind of have a slightly better time with traditionally bad matchups. Against Elves, you have not only counter spells to counter Elves on the way down, but a resolved, Lissalana or even sometimes a resolved Elvish Vanguard with a couple counters on it can be dealt with. And I think that's really why this sort of took off in a big way.
And the big thing about these two decks as well is they just see so many cards. So you're able to just really churn through your deck. When I'm playing with this deck, I typically end with less than 40 cards in my library, maybe somewhere closer to 30, upper or lower 30s. So it's very easy to see half of your deck over the course of a match, of a game, I mean. And I think that's one of the the things it has going for it is even if you don't always optimally sequence all of your cards, you're just going to see so much more than your opponent that you can really run away with the game off of that card advantage.
Yeah, and the amount of hands that you sort of start with that don't have a cantrip in them is so negligible, and those are generally not keepers that you're just chaining cantrip into cantrip in a threat, or cantrip into counterspell in a threat, or it just kind of it has a lot of built-in synergy just because it's running so many of these blue cards that let you dig into other good blue cards. And now with the change in the mana base, is there any sort of change in strategies that you'd like to employ against this?
No, the deck is still pretty weak to Electrickery, just because Delver, Miscreant, and Sprite are all 1 toughness creatures. They obviously have their own ways of combating through that. But they're mostly a blue deck. I don't think you would bring in Hydroblast against this deck ever, but you do still get to get them with Pyroblast. You do still get to get them with Electrickery. So I think that those cards, the same cards that are good against Mono Blue Delver, although maybe a little less effective, are still effective in this matchup.
I'd even argue that, Electricity's stock goes up a little bit just because you aren't running those Spire Golems. You're going to be able to kill a higher percent of what they're playing. Although I have seen some of the blue-red decks and even some of the blue decks running, some number of Augur of Bolus, which notably doesn't die to that, doesn't die to Even Car's Justice either. So I think I think when you're playing against this, it's going to be a fairly similar matchup, but they do just have the advantage of, a little bit more removal. And thankfully, because of the need for snowlands, this deck is pretty easily spotted. If your opponent goes turn 1 snowland and you know nothing else about the matchup, you can almost guaranteed make the called shot that you're playing against blue-red Delver. There's very few
of course,
other.
If you're a blue-red deck, you could just run them anyway and trick people.
Yeah, that is true. I'm kind of shocked. I've never seen the mono blue list just running the snow islands, just for the incidental advantage of someone misplaying against it. But that's deep into the mind games.
To be fair, they're a little expensive. It's $30 for 10 snow-covered islands on Moto, so that might be a reason. I actually got my snow-covered islands back when they were worthless because I thought that they were cool to run in my modern Merfolk deck. So I've just kind of had them for a long time, so that's kind of funny because I like the Easterhead Islands on the original ones. But in paper, they're of course a little bit better, $21 for the new ones. But yeah, they're a little spendy, so I could see that maybe that being a reason to not do it every single time.
No, definitely. And also as a fun little side note, did you know that there's actually a non-snow covered island with that exact same art on it?
It's not the same. It's a little different, but I do know because I own them and they're very tricky. But it's an Ice Age island, but it's not it's not the exact same picture. It is very, very similar though.
Oh no, there's one in the Cold Snap reprint decks that is the exact same art in a modern frame.
Hold on, I'm looking it up. We can continue with the episode, but
definitely.
Oh dang, you're right, dude.
Yeah,
that's awful.
Yeah, I don't know why that decision was made, but it was, and
I mean,
it's real weird.
That's cool, but yeah, why would you do that?
I don't know. All right, so that kind of covers Delver. Delver is, I would say, the premier tempo deck of the format. It's always going to be kind of, even if you go into a paper event completely blind, there's going to be some number of one or both of these lists. They're very popular. They're very good. And for the foreseeable future will stay good. I mean, if they ban Delver, they're probably going to have to change a little bit, but I don't foresee that happening anytime in the near future anyway. All right, so next on our list is Elves. And Elves kind of for years languished as kind of a tier 1.5 to tier 2 list, and it has now kind of come into its own with the printing of stuff like Elvish Vanguard and Lead the Stampede. How would you describe this deck, Adrian?
Elves is a barf your hand deck. It got some upgrades recently in the form of Elvish Vanguard, which lets the deck go tall as well as Lead the Stampede, which lets you find elves and is, in my opinion, better than the
Distant
old one.
Melody?
Distant Melody, because it costs less. It doesn't require blue, so you don't have to actually run the one of Island, and it lets you find elves even if your board is wiped. For what it's worth, listeners, I do not think that Land Grant is where the deck wants to be. I think that that's kind of a mistake, but people do what they want. I think one of the big strengths of the deck and one of the must-kill cards for it is Kyrian Ranger, which also goes into Stompy. Kyrian Ranger lets you do a whole bunch of busted stuff with Priest of Titania, Well-Wisher, Timberwatch Elf, basically any of your huge threats. Surprisingly, the deck doesn't play very many Elvish Visionaries, I don't think, anymore, which is just kind of weird because it does draw you a card, but like I said, I don't think it really runs them as much as it used to.
Yeah, so the general game plan here is kind of, play Mana Dorks on the early turns, use those Mana Dorks to cast even more Mana Dorks, and then cast, depending on what your list looks like, either Lead the Stampede or the aforementioned Distant Melody to kind of refuel, get more cards in your hand, and then dump even more cards onto the board. The difference between the two, Distant Melody and Lead the Stampede. Lead the Stampede lets the deck actually be solid mono green and not need to devote spots to producing blue mana as much. Whereas Distant Melody can be a much more impactful card. So when you're sort of playing against this deck, there's certain things. You mentioned Kyrian Ranger. I also think Priest of Titania is sort of a must-kill card for the list. If you can spare the removal, Birchlore Ranger and a Nettle Sentinel or two lets them kind of just spam out cards from their hand. Nettle Sentinel, for those newer to the format, is an elf that untaps whenever you cast a green spell, and Birchlore Rangers lets you tap 2 untapped elves you control to add a mana of any color to your mana pool. So the thing is, if you have 2 Nettle Sentinels, you tap them to produce a green mana, and if you have a 1 mana elf in your hand, you cast it and you untap both of them, and you rinse, wash, and repeat. So this deck is very, very explosive, and I think at this point it's fair to say that this is a tier 1 deck, right, Adrian?
Yes, I would definitely say so. At least right now, which is surprising because it's actually also soft to Electrickery, so you'd think that it would be a little bit worse. But I think it's just so fast.
Yeah, it's just so explosive, and once it's on the board, it's kind of really hard to, be put on the defensive against it. It just can incredibly efficiently just pump out a bunch of threats. And I think that this is in no small part of the reason why, some Tron decks are now running main deck fog effects, because decks like this just go so wide so quickly, and you have a really, really hard time actually answering them in a meaningful way. Because Electrickery is great and all, but if they have an online Timber Watch, they can save something else and the Timber Watch won't die. And, sure, Swirling Sandstorm is fine, but that also relies on you hitting 5 mana at some point. So I don't know. I think that the deck is currently very well positioned just due to how incredibly explosive it is. This is basically the Mana Dork section of Legacy Elves without the, Craterhoof or Progenitus or Natural Order style payoff to the deck. So what decks do you like against Elves?
Anything that can play spot removal and Electrickery, like Blue-Red Delver or Swirling Sandstorm. So basically anything that can kill its stuff before it gets out of control. Even then, sometimes that's not even enough. There's 40 creatures or so in this deck, so it's a lot. Like you mentioned, the Foglock is pretty good against them. They have a hard time beating that. And if you can get it going, because that's actually kind of slow, and then you still have to find a way to then defeat the rest of the elves. So it's very fast. I think a well-placed Lightning Bolt goes a long way against this deck, though, especially if they land grant and reveal their entire hand and you know exactly what to kill. So yeah, that's my opinion. What do you think?
Yeah, and I definitely think that you've highlighted one of the issues. I know we've touched on this on the show before, but there are versions of the list that run land grant, which is a 2 and a green, search your library for 4, put it into your hand, and if you have no lands in your hand, you can reveal your hand and do that instead of paying the casting cost. So I do think that this is a deck where that information is important, because there are sort of linchpin cards within this deck's game plan. So I think outside of the board wipe effects and sort of the fog lock that some of the Tron decks can put up, there's not a whole lot of great answers. But if you've got enough spot removal, you can kind of, if you get lucky, pick away at key elements and hopefully keep it under control long enough to affect your game plan as well. And I think we've already kind of covered sideboard cards that you like against this. But this is also the reason that some other Tron decks are running main deck copies of Electrickery among other decks. This is certainly a big one, because this is one of the few decks that produces mana as efficiently as the Tron decks do. Anything else on Elves, or you ready to move on to our next one here?
I think we should talk about one of their good cards. Another one of their good cards, Spider Silk Armor. Spider Silk Armor is not only their tech against electricity, it's also good against flying. It gives all your creatures reach, and so that can really, a bunch of 1/2s can cause a big problem for the Delver decks, especially since most of them have no way of getting rid of resolved Spider Silk Armor.
Yeah, there's not, most of the Delver decks are not running, Echoing Truth's main board. And I've even seen that some people have taken to running a copy or two of Spider Silk Armor in the main just because of how efficient it is against flying decks. And we're currently in a metagame where two of the more popular decks heavily feature flyers. So I think that's totally defensible. This used to be something where people would run Lumithread fields instead, right?
Yeah, and I think that that's actively worse. The morph isn't really that valuable, and being able to just slam this on turn 3 is so good.
Yeah, not needing the white mana as well, just because, most of those decks that were running Lumithread fields were not running a plains to fetch up with Sylvan Ranger. They were just hoping to get there off of Birchlore Rangers. So I think Spider Silk is a solid upgrade. I know that it's getting a little bit spendy. I'm aware, before anyone calls for, a need to reprint it, it's a little spendy, but it is a vital part of this deck. And if you're new to the format, if you like Elves and other formats, this deck is exactly the same kind of affair. You will enjoy it. Just play it. And
the way that I just remember, the way it beats Fog is it also plays, what is it called? The red direct damage spell.
Mob Justice.
Yeah, it runs Mob Justice. So I'm sorry. I'm sure some of you play a lot of Elves and are berating me over that. But yeah, they do have a way of beating that too. It's Mob Justice.
Yeah, and most of the lists are running some quantity of Viridian Longbows, which can also get around the Fog, but I mean, hopefully for the player that's trying to fog out Elves, they will, be able to stabilize with the fog lock in place and also keep up some sort of counter magic, so that way they can handle these two sort of specific threats. But it's definitely it's got outs to that situation. Also, before we move on, I do want to recommend that if you are interested in this deck, I cannot recommend more highly the Maverick Girl on Twitch, or I believe she's Maverick Gal there. Friend of the show, Kendra, does great work. It is the Maverick Girl. My apologies. She streams fairly frequently. She streams a lot of Pauper Elves, and honestly, there's no one else whose opinion I think really matters when it comes to the deck, just because she has been crushing it with this deck for so long and putting up great results with it. Really, really enjoyable streamer if you're looking to get really into this deck.
We'll link her in the comments.
Yeah, there will definitely be a link down there. Next up, this is one of your favorites. Adrian, tell me about Kuldotha Boros. Tell me what type of deck it is. Tell me what its game plan is, and
just tell you it all.
Yeah, show me your secrets.
Kuldotha Boros is Jund. Okay, no, I'll take that back. Kuldotha Boros is the format's best mid-range deck, which is kind of why I said that. I was mostly joking. Its game plan is to, and the fact that it used to be called, all right, history lesson. It used to be called Kuldotha Boros. Well, it is called Kuldotha Boros because it used to run a card called Kuldotha Rebirth, which is R for sacrifice an artifact, create 3 goblin tokens. And so it used that in order to gain this huge board advantage, and then it would play artifacts called like Ichor Wellspring, which would enter the battlefield, draw you a card, and when you sacrifice it, you also draw a card. So you had a little bit of card advantage going. The other reason you would run cards like that is because you play cards like Glinthawk and Core Skyfisher, which let you bounce permanents back to your hand. So you'd be able to basically set up your own little cantrip engine where you play like a pretty decent threat, you bounce the artifact back to your hand, and then you get to replay it. It gets to play other extremely good cards like Thraben Inspector, which lets you create clues to power on your metalcrafts that you can use Galvanic Blast. It runs a lot of red spot removal. It has blowout cards like Prismatic Strands, which are great both in combat and when you're trying to play defensively. It plays Battle Screech, which might be the best token producer in the format. And then the newer versions of the deck play a card called Alchemist's Vial, which let you sacrifice so that a creature can't attack or block. But the real big get and the real reason that it switched over to a more mid-range style instead of like an aggressive token style is because we got Palace Sentinels printed online. Palace Sentinels lets you become the Monarch, and if you're able to defend that, and in this deck it's actually very easy, you're able to just take over the game.
All right, and for folks at home who may not have drafted a whole ton of Conspiracy 2, you want to explain what being the Monarch entails?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Being the Monarch means that whoever is the Monarch gets to draw an additional card at their end step, but if combat damage is dealt to you, or if your opponent plays a card that makes them the Monarch, then they become the Monarch. So it's kind of a very high risk, high reward card, because if you ever lose the Monarch, you're probably not really in a position to take it back unless you can then follow up with another Monarch card.
Yeah, and with this deck, there's a lot of small synergies. You know, the fact that it's running a lot of flyers and also cards that produce tokens with flying means that it has a little bit easier time against some decks getting the Monarchy back if it does happen to lose it. But being the Monarch is a huge upside. A card a turn does not seem like perhaps a lot, but it's actually just, in some cases, just game breaking. You know, against slower control decks that have a hard time dealing actual combat damage to you, it just makes sure that you keep drawing cards. And, you know, again, this is another deck with a lot of sort of small synergies in between cards, because a lot of these lists, and I know you've run it in the past, I'm not sure if you're still running it, but we'll run things like Sen's Enlistment, which has Retrace, which is a funky ability that lets you recast spells with the additional cost of discarding lands. So it makes it so that even if being the Monarch is drawing you into more lands, instead of flooding out, you just have ways to turn those lands into 1/1s. So this is solidly a mid-range deck, and you just think that this is bar none the best mid-range deck in the format right now?
I do, yeah. I'm kind of. Let me check. Let me check. I mean, I guess if you want to consider Alchemy a mid-range list. No, I think it's better than Alchemy. Yeah, I think it's just the best mid-range list in the format, even better than Mono Black Control. I know a lot of people have a big soft spot for Mono Black Control. Trust me too. It's a fun deck. You get to play bears, you get to play Grey Ogres that draw you cards. It's a lot of fun. But I think Kuldotha Boros is, I mean, there's a reason it's, you know, I consider it one of the pillars of the format and not Mono Black Control, and I think it's just the best mid-range deck. Now, that being said, it has all the problems mid-range decks have too, which is that it cannot beat Tron.
Yeah, so maybe elaborate a little bit more as to why Tron presents a unique difficulty for this deck to deal with.
Sure. So Tron is a big mana deck, right? We can all agree on that. Tron, it just goes over the top, because the longer you drag the game out, the more mana Tron has, and the more likely they are to just be like, well, you played a thing, well, I played a much bigger thing, or I played a much scarier thing, or now I'm flickering my Denrova Horror and there's no chance you can win. So it can really leverage its mana advantage against a deck like this that's probably tapping out every turn and has no interaction on the stack. Sorry, you're gonna say something?
At least main board. So I think that's a very important thing, because while we're not covering it this week, we will talk about Tron, and that deck really does represent a somewhat unique position in the metagame. So big mana decks aren't good. I have to imagine that this is probably, you know, pretty much neck and neck with Delver, right?
Yeah, it can go back and forth. Monarch is kind of dangerous against Delver because they have way more flying creatures than you do, and all it takes is one of them to take that away from you. And if they're blue-red, they also have the removal suite, and all of your creatures die to it. Also, tapping out on turn 4 for Palace Sentinels is like not great against that deck. But other than that, like, yeah, it's about neck and neck. Who draws more removal? Who draws more flyers? They're probably cantripping a little bit more than you are, but if you have the engine online, like, you can keep up with them, I think. in most cases. Obviously, like so we get card advantage on two different axes here. They're a Gush deck. That's like their best card draw spell. Ours is probably Palace Sentinels, right? Just becoming the Monarch is just a free source of card advantage for the rest of the game as long as you can protect it. So it's really like it's a very, in my opinion, classic matchup of the current Pauper meta: the Gush versus the Monarch.
Okay. Now, in terms of we've talked about like good bad matchups. What kind of effects really sort of tank this deck's chances? Like what sort of effects are you kind of dreading your opponent having access to?
So that's just it. Really, it's only Tron. The deck doesn't really have truly bad matchups, I don't think. I think it kind of has game against the entire field. It's just that Tron can just absolutely crush it with the mana advantage. But I don't know. I don't really mind anything. Like, let's look at our sideboard. You know, I have like Trickery for the Delver decks. I have Gorilla Shaman for Affinity. Definitely not the Mirror, though, by the way. This is the Gorilla Shaman's a trap in the Mirror. Pyroblast for all the random blue decks. Relic of Progenitus for the Graveyard. Lone Missionary to gain life. Standard Bearer for Boggles. Core Sanctifiers, that might not be what I would run. I would probably run something else, but Core Sanctifiers is good. And so you just have a very wide sideboard position, because white is like the best sideboard color in Pauper, and then you're backing it up with some of the best red cards in the format as well.
Okay, that all definitely makes sense. Now we've talked about this deck in the past, and we've kind of highlighted this as a unique thing in Pauper, and you did kind of, jokingly make the comparison to Jund. Are there any other decks you can think of in different formats that if someone's new to the format and perhaps plays other formats, you might be able to compare this to? So people are obviously going to balk at the Jund analogy.
This deck has like no disruption outside of the burn spells, which I don't even think they really qualify, honestly. But it follows sort of the Jund. No, not even. Sorry, I'm trying to think. Like what modern deck would I compare this to? I don't think it is Jund. I think Jund draws up the idea of like discard spells, maybe.
I could argue a case for like the old black-green rock style decks where it was just kind of like, I'm going to play very efficient things on every turn. I'm going to be doing something every turn, and you've got your whole turn to figure out what you're going to do about it. Kind of mid-range where, you're not hyper aggressive, you're not hyper controlling, you're just kind of constantly doing stuff and having a handful of answers if necessary to your opponent's plan.
Yeah, that makes sense. It really is like to its core mid-range deck.
All right, and before we move on, Palace Sentinels or tokens?
I think personally that Palace Sentinels is the better version of the deck right now. I've gone back and forth with one of my local friends over it, and I just think that Palace Sentinels is where you want to be. We're debating at length about whether or not you wanted to be a Seeker of the Way version of the deck, and then I think then maybe you want to be a little bit more tokens heavy, because then you want to attack every turn, so it doesn't really make any sense to play a super defensive card like Palace Sentinels. But I think that Palace Sentinels, I mean, the deck I think was really good before. I did play a lot of the old list as well, but once I started playing the Monarch version, I've actually never gone back. So I do think the Monarch version is better.
Yeah, and if you're playing against this, obviously the Monarch cards are very powerful unless you think you can steal the Monarchy away on the next turn. And even then, if you have access to, be able to counter this I would say is a prime counterspell target. And unless you're really confident in your ability to get in next turn, in which case you can potentially turn this into an advantage for you. As Adrian touched upon, it is a very, very high variance mechanic in that if your opponent gets control of the Monarchy, that is very, very bad for you, because not only are you not drawing cards, they are. So
you will very rarely just slam this on turn 4. The only time I could think of doing that would be if your opponent is like, maybe if you have 2 in your hand, you can get through a counter spell and your opponent has no creatures on the board.
I was gonna say I wouldn't mind just slamming this against like Tron if they've got a slow opener.
Yeah, against Tron, Palace Sentinels I think is your best bet to beat them, because that's how you can keep up on a form of advantage. You're drawing more cards than they are, and so you can help negate the mana advantage a little bit.
All right, that definitely makes sense. All right. So, anything else on your pet deck, if you will, or do we want to move things along?
Let's move to my next pet deck.
All right. Next up is Affinity, and I know you played this a lot back in the day, but are you still bringing this out of retirement every so often, or is this kind of on the shelf for you?
It's mostly on the shelf. Actually, to be honest with you, I've been really into Is It Delver lately. I just, like, I'm going to say it again. I've said it a couple times. I really think that Gush is the best single card in the format. Really, really, honestly, truly believe that. So make of that what you will. But Affinity is another barf deck, just like Elves. You basically just want to dump your hand. The issue with Affinity is that it loses to itself kind of a lot because your mana base is not really that good. You have no duels, and then you have to play cards like Springleaf Drum, which is super, super useless in the late game.
Yeah, it definitely is one of those kind of high variance decks because most of these lists aren't running that many lands, and again, they're all monocolored lands because they're running the affinity the artifact lands because they kind of are soul lands in this deck. You do kind of get 2 mana off of them for a decent chunk of your spells. So
I will say that the decks where you win with Affinity, the games feel unlosable. And also, there are some matchups where you can just sandbag fling. Like if you're playing against a deck and somehow like let's pretend they're not a blue deck. Let's say that they're, I don't know, Stompy or something, or anything. Not Elves. I think that might actually not be good here. But let's say that they're a deck that for some reason never represents counterspell. You can basically sandbag fling in your hand or ATOG if they have removal until you draw the fling and then just kill them in one turn. The combo kill I think is very potent with this deck. And we have it here in the show notes. It's an aggro deck that can also be a combo deck.
Yeah, and I think that's the key thing. So it utilizes the affinity mechanic from original Mirrodin block, and actually the one card that they printed with not quite affinity but pretty much affinity in Kaladesh. But it's seeking to leverage artifact synergies to cast creatures that are much bigger than their mana cost would kind of belay. So it's running, Carapace Forager, which is a 2 mana 4/4 in this deck most of the time. It's running Mirror Enforcer, which frequently is a 1 or 0 mana 4/4 by the time that you've worked up the resources to cast it. It's running ATOG so that it can just chew up its board and all of a sudden have a 20 power creature. It's got a lot of angles of attack, but again, I think the big thing about this deck is it is kind of one of those decks that loses to itself sometimes, because I've definitely played against this deck and just kind of been like, all right, my sideboard didn't matter because they mulliganed to 4. And as long as I do something with a relative amount of speed here, they're just not coming back from that.
And the deck is also incredibly soft to Gorilla Shaman. Like, that's the reason people play Gorilla Shaman, is because otherwise Affinity is just absolutely busted.
Yeah, Gorilla Shaman is nice to keep this deck in check, because I've had those games. I'm sure you have as well, where you got to resolve a Gorilla Shaman early game against an Affinity opponent and then just blew up all their stuff.
Yeah, if on your, let's say Affinity is on the play, and for some reason their hand is not that good, and they have like triple lands and 1 drop, 2 drop, but they're not creatures or whatever, I don't know. And just on your turn 2, you just kill one of their lands. Even that's pretty bad. They only have 16 of them,
Yeah, because I mean the thing is, like, Gorilla Shaman at bare minimum is cheaper than casting Stone Rain, like in this one narrow matchup, and in best case, it just forces your opponent to have exactly Great Furnace untapped and Galvanic Blast or a Bolt if they're running it. And outside of that, there's no reasonable way that they can actually answer that threat to their board. So I guess what kind of decks, you kind of alluded to it. What decks does Affinity suffer from being paired against?
Any decks with access to Gorilla Shaman.
Just Gorilla Shaman?
No, any decks with access to any of the incredible array of artifact hate that Wizards has printed in every single color over the years. Except black. I guess black doesn't really have anything.
Yeah, black does have a decent chunk of removal though, which definitely helps it out in this situation. So yeah, like going through just off the top of my head, there's Gorilla Shaman, there's Ancient Grudge, there's Gleeful Sabotage will hit 2 of your things. Natural State's a 1 mana piece of removal against you.
That can kill your lands.
Yeah, they can kill your lands. That's the other thing. Atog's weak against Deadweight and black. And then also there's the fact that like the fling plan is off the table if you're a blue deck, because unless you tap out, most pretty good affinity pilots, Adrian included, will not go for the fling kill unless they are guaranteed that it will resolve, because getting blown out in that situation a lot of the times means you're down to like maybe 2 lands and a creature, like best case scenario.
Yeah, if even.
Yeah. Now, playing against this deck, it is important to, if your opponent has an Atog on the board, be hyper aware of how much they can deal if they have the fling in hand. If your affinity opponent passes the turn and they have the mana to cast fling, and you count up all the artifacts they have in play, and it's enough to make a lethally sized Atog, make sure that you don't tap out against that. It's just...
Yeah, the other thing too is Atog is also just so good because they don't even have to fling to kill you, right? They can just sack their stuff to Atog and kill you, like, in attacks.
Yeah, like there's a lot of paths. Like some of the decks will run Teamer Battle Rage, which, 1 red, it's an instant, gives a creature double strike, but then if their power is 4 or greater, which you can very quickly make Atog into a 4 power or greater creature, it gives it trample as well. So there's a lot of angles that this thing attacks at. They're all very fast, but there are very, very hard counters that you can run to this strategy. And I think that's the only reason that we don't have the artifact lands banned in this format, is just the fact that there's some really, really brutal sideboard options for this deck.
Yeah, and the cranial plating is the card that is banned, which is why people don't play it. So
yeah, cranial plating was banned preemptively before the format was formalized, and I think we're better for it. I don't want to live in a world where this deck can run 4 cranial platings in it, because that's just
the reason I
miserable.
bring it up is it's interesting because the opposite is true in Modern, where cranial plating is legal, but the lands are banned.
Yeah, they do still have Dark Steel Citadel, the indestructible one, and they do get access to the
that's true.
They do get access to the Nexi, the Blink Moth and Ink Moth, which can be artifacts. All right, so we covered 5 decks today, and these are, I do want to say, they're not, this isn't like the definitive chunk tier 1. But these 5 decks are a really great place to sort of get your start in Pauper. Any one of these decks, they are going to give you a good play experience, and they're going to lead to interesting games. So obviously, Adrian, if I had to guess, right now you're on a Blue-Red Delver deck. Is that a deck that you'd recommend for a newer player to this format?
I don't think so, unless you know... I think knowledge of that deck, and I'm not trying to say, oh man, that deck's only for smart, experienced people. Not at all. I think that part of the challenge, especially for me, I'm not really a blue player. The challenge for me is when I look at 3 cards off a Ponder, do you shuffle? Do you keep? What do you do? It really depends on you knowing the other person's deck really well, and then you saying, yeah, I could take this 1 card and then shuffle the rest away and then gush, and then, there's just so much thinking involved, basically, that I wouldn't recommend it unless you have a pretty good knowledge of the format. Out of these decks, I think the best starter deck is probably Elves or Affinity.
Okay, fair enough. Both are fairly straightforward combo decks. I don't want to, belittle the complexity of them as decks, but I think both of them are something that someone could pick up, play, and probably have a reasonable time with. Now, I know you kind of touched on, the skill barrier. Would you say that Delver is more something that is a skill barrier with regards to Pauper, or do you think that someone who's played, for example, a legacy Delver deck would probably have a decent time with Blue-Red Delver? Do you think it's just specific knowledge of the format, or do you think it's just dealing with these, and I really hate this, the skill testingness of blue cantrips in Eternal formats?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think that knowing what to get is important, and then knowing how the cantrips operate is also important. And I don't know if that's like a cop-out answer, but I think that they both feed into each other. If you don't know how to sequence your cantrips, you'll do it suboptimally, and so you won't be able to see as many cards. And then if you don't know what cards you want to be looking for in a given matchup, then I think your performance is also going to suffer.
Yeah, and with all this said, like I don't think that any deck in Pauper is so skill testing that, you know, an experienced player couldn't hop in with it and kind of figure things out. It might not be immediately intuitive, but I would definitely say that Elves and Affinity are decks that once you see someone play them once, it kind of makes sense because the deck is proactive, whereas Delver's a little bit more reactive, and it's kind of it's the same reason you don't goldfish a control deck, because that does nothing. Without someone across the table from you, your reactive elements are never going to be something that factors in, right?
Right.
All right, so 5 decks covered, you know, briefly. This is not intended as kind of an in-depth discussion of each of these decks. We've done deck techs on a lot of these decks in the past, and you can definitely go through our back catalog, find those. They're mostly still relevant. A couple of them are kind of on the more outdated side of things, and we should probably readdress them at some point. But in the next week, maybe 2, we're going to cover a bunch of other decks that are relevant to the format, and hopefully this will help people who are both new to the format or perhaps want a little bit more guidance on what the format looks like to kind of see the decks that are important in the metagame, why they're important, and how you play against them as a player. Adrian, is there anything else you want to sort of say to the people before we close things down this week?
No, I think we're good. Stay tuned for next week. If you like any of these decks, you know, they're fun. Pauper's a fun format, and we got a lot to go. So buckle up, buckaroos. And
we will be posting links in the description down below on YouTube, and also in the description of the podcast on whatever medium you're finding us on, to the different lists that we've covered here. There will be links to MTG Goldfish, which is a great resource for this type of stuff. They post lists that have placed in Magic Online events, so you can look not only at one list, but the entirety of that archetype. You can go back and you can look at what Blue-Red Delver looked like 2 or 3 months ago to today. So, great resource.
And don't forget... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, don't forget Maverick Girl, Elf streamer. Check it out.
Yes, definitely. She will also be in the description down below. All right, Adrian, you want to take us out for the day?
Sure. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Our patron shout out is going to go to, let me just pull this up here. We'll do Sharky's Machine. Sharky's Machine, this one's for you. This podcast is brought to you by Sharky's Machine and the support of all of our other patrons. Please consider supporting us if you like the show. Check this video or the description on this podcast of details on where to find us. We'd like to remind you, if you're listening to this on a platform with reviews, they're always appreciated because they boost our visibility. If you've got a deck list or an idea for a topic, send it to us. Feel free to contact us either via our website or by emailing us directly at colorcommentary@gmail.com. Special thanks to Pat's Games, my LGS, and JP Comics, Mike's LGS, and of course the ever musical L. You can find our theme song Quantitative and other great tracks over on his SoundCloud, soundcloud.net/ELLELLELL. Till next week, this is Adrian and Mike, and we are signing off for Color Commentary.